Good morning, everyone. We're hosting research session number 2 on kidney research and clinical trials. We're continuing on to talk about the need for more patients in clinical trials. We have a panel of experts who will discuss different aspects of patients being involved in clinical trials. Our first presenter is Dr. Katherine Tuttle. She is the Executive Director for Research at Providence Healthcare. She's also investigator on the Kidney Precision Medicine Project, where her and I serve as co-chair for the Community Engagement Committee. She is also Professor of Medicine at the University of Washington and co-PI at the Institute of Translational Health Services. Dr. Tuttle, I turn it over to you.
I'm Katherine Tuttle. I'm Executive Director for Research at Providence Healthcare and a Professor of Medicine at the University of Washington. It's my privilege today to give you a presentation regarding the Kidney Precision Medicine Project. Our objectives will be to review the common causes and consequences of chronic kidney disease and acute kidney injury, recognize current treatments and how they're utilized, and then discuss advancing care by patient-led approaches in the Kidney Precision Medicine Project. Diabetes and hypertension are the most common causes of chronic kidney disease worldwide. In fact, diabetes accounts for over 40% of all cases of CKD, followed next by hypertension, accounting for about 18% of cases. So together, these two causes are responsible for half or more of all chronic kidney disease in the world. Diabetes is a particularly important problem. There are 476 million adults living with diabetes today, and 4 of 10, or 40% of them, will eventually develop chronic kidney disease. This slide illustrates the enormous burden of diabetes in the world and the projections for what's coming in the future. So while today there may be 476 million, you can see that in every region of the world, by the year 2043, prevalence of diabetes will increase. And in the countries shown in the green box in the lower part of the globe, all of these countries will experience more than a 50% increase in people with diabetes. Increasing numbers of people with diabetes means that more people will develop diabetic kidney disease. And this is a very serious matter. Chronic kidney disease is still very common in both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And in type 1 diabetes occurs in about 30%. And as I mentioned before, in type 2 diabetes occurs in about 40%. And it's responsible for half of all cases of chronic kidney disease and end-stage kidney disease worldwide. But this really underestimates the total burden of diabetes in patients with kidney disease. Because if we look at American patients, where we actually collect data on patients who are treated by dialysis or kidney transplant, we see that diabetes occurs in 66 to 86%. The reason for that is that some people have another form of chronic kidney disease, say polycystic kidney disease, and happen to also have diabetes. The other reason is, especially in transplantation, many of the medications that we give, such as tacrolimus or prednisone, can increase the risk of diabetes developing after transplantation. So in the field of nephrology, the majority of our patients actually have diabetes. It's also important to recognize that chronic kidney disease amplifies cardiovascular disease risk. And in fact, almost all of the excess risk of cardiovascular disease in patients with diabetes occurs in that 40% who have CKD. So this is very important from the perspective of diabetes, from nephrology and cardiology. So what are the risks of developing diabetic kidney disease? Why do we care? Well, in nephrology, our conventional focus has been on progression to end-stage kidney disease requiring dialysis or kidney transplant. But the truth is that that's only about 10% of patients. The other 90% will die of other causes without reaching end-stage kidney disease. In the vast majority, it will be a cardiovascular death, but infections, which are particularly becoming more prominent during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially pneumonias and sepsis, will be responsible for another third of deaths. So diabetic kidney disease is risky, not only because it can produce end-stage kidney disease, but even more commonly, it leads to premature death. When we look at data from the United States, we collect this data in a registry called the United States Renal Data System. And this is data, the most recent data, from the United States Renal Data System. The top two lines in the left panel show in yellow numbers of patients with diabetes, and in gray, numbers of patients with hypertension. Now, those numbers on the left are incident rates. So for those of you who don't think about statistics too often, that means the rate of new cases per year. And as you can see, for about the past decade, there's been a stabilization in those rates, probably because of better diabetes care and hypertension management. However, look to the panel on the right, and you see that both the yellow and the gray lines are increasing. Now, this is actually a prevalence rate. Now, a prevalence rate is the total number of patients, not the percent of new cases each year. Why would prevalence be rising when incidence is stable? It's because there are more people living with diabetes. It harkens back to the picture I showed you of the globe, where the number of people living with diabetes continues to increase. So if there's a bigger pool of people with diabetes, even if kidney disease is developing at the same proportional rate, the total number with kidney disease will increase. So we have to do much more than what we've currently been doing if we want to flatten the curve in yet another way. The other important issue is not only being alive, but productive life years. And this is a slide that may look a little bit complex, but it tells an important story if you simply look at the size of the bars in 1990 versus 2017. You can see across all ages, those bars are taller in 2017 than 1990. We measure something called productive life years, either by people becoming disabled or dying prematurely. The yellow and red are type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and the Carolina blue is hypertension. And you can see that the number of life years lost to either being disabled or dying before your time has only increased during this time period. So clearly, diabetes and hypertension are affecting not only duration of life, but quality of life severe enough to lead to disability. So there really is a pressing need for new therapies, especially for diabetic and hypertensive chronic kidney disease. Now, this is a complicated slide, and please don't even try to read it. But what it's meant to show you is that major professional organizations, I've illustrated just two major ones, on the left, American Diabetes Association, and on the right, KDIGO, which is our international guideline forming group for kidney disease. All of them have recommended certain treatments related to blood pressure management in diabetic patients, most specifically agents called ACE inhibitors or ARBs, angiotensin receptor blockers. We did clinical trials of these agents in the 1990s and the very early 2000s. The last important trial that led to these recommendations was published in 2001. So we're nearly 20 years into having these agents available to treat diabetic kidney disease, with recommendations from major professional societies that this is indicated to reduce risk of diabetic kidney disease. It was based on these old studies. Again, you can see on the bottom, the references are from 2001. These were two different trials of patients with type 2 diabetes who had chronic kidney disease, and they were treated with an angiotensin receptor blocker. In the Renal trial, losartan versus placebo as a control, and an IDNT irbesartan, either versus placebo or another blood pressure lowering therapy that does not have specific kidney protective effects. You can see the line for either losartan on the left or irbesartan on the right is lower than the other lines. Those were time to event curves, which showed that fewer patients over time had the event of progression of kidney disease, which was doubling of serum creatinine, kidney failure, or death. However, notice that the effect is pretty small, meaning the lines aren't very far apart. And if you look at 48 months or 4 years, how much residual risk is there of kidney failure, death, or substantial loss of kidney function measured by doubling of serum creatinine? Well, there's still an absolute risk of 40% that's left. So that's a huge amount of risk that's left on the table, meaning many patients who get these agents are still going to progress to adverse outcomes. So this is what drove those recommendations 20 years ago, that these would be the standard of care for diabetic kidney disease. However, now nearly 20 years out, how are we doing with getting these to patients? This is data, real-world data from two large U.S. healthcare systems, UCLA and Providence St. Joseph Health, where I work, looking at utilization of different medications in patients with CKD. Now, these were patients with CKD stages 3 to 5, so this is moderate to severe CKD. And if you look at the bars for ACE inhibitors and ARBs, we have increased use over time from 2006 to 2017. Notice that the absolute amount of use is very low. Overall, in the CKD population, it was only 14%. If we look at the subset who have the hardest indication, meaning the most strongly recommended for use, which would be patients with diabetes, CKD, and hypertension together, we got up to a whopping 25%. So one of the reasons that our outcomes aren't better than they are is that, first off, the agents have a modest effect on kidney disease, but it's a rare patient who is even receiving recommended care. So this is a huge unmet need to not only develop new therapies, but when they are developed, to find better ways to deliver them. Also note on the right hand of the slide, many of you may be familiar with non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Patients with chronic kidney disease are advised to avoid these agents because of harms. They make kidney failure worse. There's also an association with proton pump inhibitors shown in the next set of bars to the left of NSAIDs, which have also been associated with progression of CKD. You can recognize that together we're actually using more harmful agents in the form of proton pump inhibitors and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs than we are in using protective agents in the form of ACE inhibitors or ARBs. So this is really a very sobering report on notes from the field. Another important condition that we are addressing in the Kidney Precision Medicine Project is acute kidney injury. So let's take a moment to talk about what that is and why it's important. Acute kidney injury is a form of kidney disease that usually occurs in hospitalized patients, and it lasts less than 7 days. And we define it by a change in kidney function measured by a higher creatinine and low urine volume. 2/3 of acute kidney injury, also called AKI events, in hospitalized patients will resolve within 7 days, and the outcome for these people is generally good with a 1-year survival over 90%. However, in patients with non-resolved AKI during hospitalization, the outlook is much more dim, meaning nearly half will die, and of those who survive to discharge, 23% or nearly 1/4 will die within 1 year. Acute kidney injury, or AKI, is actually common during hospitalizations, and this shows the worldwide prevalence of acute kidney injury during hospitalization. On average, it's 17%, but as you can see in the US, it's up to 25%, or 1 in 4 patients will develop acute kidney injury. So it's common and associated with adverse outcomes, particularly if it doesn't resolve during hospitalization. Acute kidney injury is a very general term, and like CKD, there are many different causes. Again, don't struggle with all of the details. But on the left, you see a Venn diagram of all the different conditions that we associate with acute kidney injury. But some of the most common are sepsis or overwhelming infection, shock, cardiac surgery, heart failure, drugs, and nephrotoxins. The treatment is very nonspecific. In this state-of-the-art review, actually written by one of the Kidney Precision Medicine Project investigators, John Kellum, it really in some ways is a little depressing in that we have no specific treatments. Treat the cause or the trigger. So treat the heart failure. If you want to avoid the kidney failure, avoid new toxins or insults. Maintain blood pressure and blood volume for optimal blood flow to the kidney. Supportive care, no specific treatments that are available. And this is a real problem considering the risks associated with the condition. We know very, very little about it, which is why we have very little to offer. So when we think about new approaches to therapies, and in this case I am focusing on drug therapies, It really has been more like the Jackson Pollock painting on the right, which was named Convergence, which is really a series of random observations that occasionally are thrown like paint at the wall to try to test a new therapy. But as you can see, we've accomplished not much. Where we really want to go is to personalized therapy, which I've represented on the right with a patient actually informing another patient during a peer-to-peer session on what the kidney does and about kidney disease as part of an educational effort. So we want to go from something that's very non-specific and very random to something that's very focused and very personal. So that leads us to the Kidney Precision Medicine Project, which is designed to address these important problems: diabetic and hypertensive CKD and acute kidney injury. And one of the problems is that we don't really know what's going on in the kidney. So the goal is to ethically and safely obtain kidney biopsies from study participants with these conditions. And to create a new reference kidney atlas, it may surprise you to know that the last atlas was created in the 1950s. And we know now there are many more cells and structures that were not previously identified and are important for both health and disease. And we need to have this information in order to understand what's normal and what is disease as is not normal. So we will find disease subgroups to stratify patients. We'll identify the cells, pathways, and targets for new therapies so that we can devise individualized treatments by expanding the scientific knowledge base and improving the pipeline. And I've illustrated on the right some work from our own research group that studies diabetic kidney disease. And this is just to show you how different the kidney disease can be in patients who on the surface look very much the same. So these are kidney biopsies that were performed in patients with diabetes and CKD stage 3 with what we call macroalbuminuria, or high levels of albumin in the urine. The top left panel is a normal glomerulus for reference. The glomerulus is the structure in the kidney where blood is filtered to initially form urine, a very important target of kidney disease and diabetes. The rest of the sections, B through F, are from different patients. And you can see a progressively increasing severity of kidney lesions. In the B panel, we would call that mild mesangial expansion. You see more red stuff in the middle than on the normal panel in A. In C, this has progressed to form nodules in some little areas where the blood vessels are broken down. In D, they form overt nodules that we call Kimmel-Steele-Wilson nodules, a real sine qua non of classic diabetic kidney disease. In the next one, we've used a different stain, so we can even show that there are aneurysms in the microvasculature in this one. And then finally in F, that glomerulus is completely scarred. Why would we think that the same treatment would work the same way in all these people? And so what we really need to get down to are much more specific and targeted treatments so that we don't overtreat some patients in B who may not need very much therapy, and we don't undertreat some of the more severe lesions. So what about patients? How have patients been involved in this project? Well, patients have been involved from the very beginning. Richard Knight is a member of the Community Engagement Committee, your current president of AAKP, and Paul Conway, your past president, is on the External Evaluation Panel, a group that helps to oversee the project and provide advice to the investigators. And we convened a patient engagement work group from the very beginning of the KPMP project because we recognized that patient priorities had rarely been considered, especially in the basic science or the discovery phase of research. Patients have been more involved in clinical research in recent years, but we believed that having patients involved early could make the science better and eventually make it more likely to translate to something that would actually help patients. So along with Richard, I have the privilege of co-leading the Community Engagement Committee with him. And we have been involved in virtually every activity of the Kidney Precision Medicine Project. Our Community Engagement Committee includes patients prominently. 15 patients are actually on the Community Engagement Committee. They are the largest group on the Community Engagement Committee. But then there are investigators and also clinicians who treat patients with kidney diseases on the committee as well, for a total of about 30 of us. Our members participate in everything from the leadership at the steering committee level to activities such as the website and developing slide image viewers, advice on recruitment, even scientific objectives, and then more perhaps traditional activities for community engagement, such as community outreach by community advisory boards. Importantly, for the first time in the Kidney Precision Medicine Project, we did three things that either hadn't been done or only rarely were done. First off, the Community Engagement Committee, importantly informed by the patients on the group, wrote the informed consent document, which is required for patients to sign up for the study, and made it relevant to them and in an understandable way that they thought that common people could understand. So we got rid of the scientific jargon and made it clear to patients, and also tried to explain the patient priorities were front and center to the KPMP. We also wrote an ethics statement that really codifies the ethical approach to research, again, prominently informed by the patient members. And then finally, for the first time ever, to the best of our knowledge, in federally funded research, we were able to obtain no-fault harm insurance coverage for physical injuries. Now, this might sound like it should be an obvious part of every research study, but the truth is that if a person is injured in a research study, most of the time the informed consent document will say that the patient or their insurance company is responsible for paying for those injuries. So for example, if a person had a bleed after the kidney biopsy for the Kidney Precision Medicine Project and had to stay in the hospital an extra day, that normally would be on them and their insurance company. And that's true of almost all, well, it's true of all research that's federally funded up until the KPMP. And one of the patients on the Community Engagement Committee galvanized a group composed of other patients and investigators on KPMP to obtain what's called no-fault harm insurance. So the long and short of it is, after a long and arduous process, we do now have an insurance policy that should a complication occur, that the costs of that would be covered by this insurance policy and not by the patient or their personal health insurance. This just illustrates the structure of the KPMP and the patient contributions. So as you see at top is the Oversight Committee, the External Evaluation Panel. The star there indicates a patient member, in this case, Paul Conway. There's also a patient member on the Data Safety Monitoring Board. And then we have the Institutional Review Board, which is an ethics committee from Washington University in St. Louis, that are external oversight committees. And then below is our complex structure. Again, unless you're interested in a particular committee, there's probably, the specifics aren't important, except that you can see there's patient representation on every one of these committees. If there isn't representation, we will often have an ad hoc member from the Community Engagement Committee join those groups for deliberations that require or would benefit from patient input. And then this has really been our overarching principle of patient engagement and research. Again, read the details if you want, but just focus on the arrow that shows increasing stakeholder influence on the research. And patients are the most important stakeholders. So this, in our context, refers to patients. And, you know, at the very basic level, some studies provide only information, some get consultations, some involve people more, like committee work. But I would like to point out that our patients not only are informing, consulting, and are involved, they're also collaborators who've been empowered to do their own research within KPMP. And I'm proud to say that our patient members have published a major editorial in Nature Reviews Nephrology in our field that has the highest impact factor for a journal. Impact factor means most read, most cited in the field. 3 of our patients wrote an editorial, an invited editorial for that journal. And then in the previous slide, you'll see there was a reference to C. Jason. We've written a paper that describes the community engagement in Kidney Precision Medicine Project and how it has improved the science by incorporating patient priorities. And then there will also be an upcoming editorial in Kidney International that was also invited by the editor-in-chief to complement an initial paper that's coming out to describe the Kidney Precision Medicine Project for professionals. Those papers will all publish by the end of the year, so there will be 3 patient-led papers in the public domain, which I'm proud to say is more than any other committee on the KPMP. So not only are patients informing, consulting, and involving, but they're empowered, and they now are our most prolific authors and publishing on the Kidney Precision Medicine Project. So they are investigators and partners with us on the project. So I'll wind up by saying that in the Kidney Precision Medicine Project, what we're addressing are diabetes and hypertension because they're the most common causes of chronic kidney disease. They have a high risk of death and kidney failure, and the current treatments are substandard and underutilized. AKI is targeted because it occurs frequently in hospitalized patients. It too is associated with a high risk of death and other complications, and there's only supportive care available without specific treatments. And our patient-guided priorities in the Kidney Precision Medicine Project will produce new personalized treatments for diabetic and hypertensive chronic kidney disease and acute kidney injury. And we will do this by more clearly defining the clinical criteria with tissue-based profiling and biomarkers that'll help us get the right treatment to the right patient at the right time, the aspirational goal for precision medicine. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present the Kidney Precision Medicine Project, and most importantly, how patients are informing the priorities and the science. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Tuttle. Now I have a question for you. You have an international reputation as a patient advocate and as a top champion for including patient preference data in research efforts. As a matter of fact, during the month of August, you completed 2 articles with patients on patient engagement. Do you believe patient involvement in clinical trials will expand over the next decade? And if so, what can patients do to accelerate the process for patient inclusion?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's very important because one of the outputs of the Kidney Precision Medicine Project and many others to discover new treatments is eventually they have to be tested in patients if we're going to be able to use them to improve clinical care. So yes, we're already seeing an uptick in clinical trials in nephrology. Our field previously was behind other fields, but that's changed rapidly. And we have more clinical trials going on now than ever. Many of them are delivering. We actually have a new class of agents called the SGLT2 inhibitors that has been approved for diabetic kidney disease and probably will soon be approved for other forms of chronic kidney disease. And there are many others that are close on the heels to approval. But we won't get those to patients without completing the trials. But what I've seen is a real shift in the field. With the innovation, there has been an uptick in excitement and enthusiasm from clinicians and investigators, which then translates to patients being excited about potential treatments to prevent the horrible complications of their condition. So we've already seen a culture shift, but we really need an on-study culture in nephrology where we really do research at the point of care so that, one, it's more relevant and more likely to be implemented as opposed to the ACE inhibitors and ARBs, which were conducted in rarefied clinical trial environments and clinical research centers. We really need to be doing these studies in the clinics where the real patients are. It'll increase access and participation, but again, on the other side of it, greater relevance and greater chance of implementation and practice if that's how the trials are conducted. With regard to patients being involved, I think one, again, having research at the point of care where most patients receive their care will increase access. But also, I think the efforts of AAKP and some other organizations to form patient registries, that is, people who will provide information about who they are, their condition, what they're interested in, so that if a clinical trial becomes available, they can be contacted directly. Now, of course, we have to have their permission to do that. We can't do that without them, self volunteering, if you will. But I know in my own practice, that's one of the most common questions I get asked is, what else can I do? Is there a study for me? And part of the problem is that we haven't had an organized effort. And so I really applaud AAKP for their efforts to put together this registry for people who want to get involved in trials. And then, of course, continuing the advocacy work to make patients aware of clinical trials and how important they are. And then finally, the thing I always tell my own patients is, if you join a clinical trial, you're going to get better care no matter what group you get in. That's one of the reasons we always have to do a placebo or control group, because almost all the patients get better in the trial. And in order to test whether or not the new treatment is actually adding anything, we have to have a control group, because everyone gets better, and it might be just simply because of the attention they're receiving in the structure of the clinical trial. So I always tell them, you have nothing to lose, because you'll get even better care in the trial. And it's not because I'm a different doctor in the clinical trial than I am in the clinic, but it's the whole system of care that's provided, which is much more comprehensive. And then importantly, patients pay more attention to themselves when they're in a trial. They have accountability, for example, to say, measure their blood pressure and report back. And so everybody's just doing a better job. So I would say clinical trials are a way to improve clinical care in general and advance therapeutics in particular.
Thank you for your thoughtful response, Dr. Tuttle. Now, our next presenter is Dr. Pamela Tenaerts. She is the Executive Director of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. Dr. Tenaerts, I'd like to turn it over to you, please.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to the annual patient meeting from the American Association of Kidney Patients. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about CTTI and the future of evidence generation, and specifically our vision for Clinical Trials 2030. So first, we'll start off by telling you a little bit more about CTTI. So CTTI, which is short for the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, is a multi-stakeholder public-private partnership that was co-founded by Duke University and the Food and Drug Administration in 2007. And we really work through a multi-stakeholder approach where we involve all the stakeholders. I'll talk a little bit more about that. We're evidence-based in that we're using a social science team to help us get from individual opinion about a topic to a trend. And we've been lucky enough to have had some impact by being referenced in regulatory documents and other documents. And through these three strengths, we hope to transform clinical trials. And our mission is really to develop and drive adoption of practices that will increase quality and efficiency of clinical trials. And we've been lucky enough to have the participation of 500 and more organizations, and have about 80 member organizations at the moment. So in our organization, I talked about being multi-stakeholder, and what that means in addition is that every stakeholder has an equal voice. So we work, as you can tell here, with anyone who has a stake in the clinical trial enterprise, which includes patients, caregivers, and patient advocacy group. And importantly, everyone has a seat, an equal seat at the table. So patient engagement has been very core to the mission of CTTI. And we've done different things in this space. What we've done, for one, is normed, like really without any question, the inclusion of patients as equal partners into every aspect of clinical trials. And with that in mind, we have patients and caregivers on project team who have played a critical role in shaping many projects at CTTI. We've also, a couple of years ago, co-founded the Patient Engagement Collaborative with the FDA, and almost all CTTI recommendations advocate for involving all stakeholders, and particularly patients, in the process, including our quality by design work, which currently was included in the ICH E8 renovation. So here's a view of the CTTI membership, and as you'll see, there's different tranches. The top tranche is industry, which includes pharma, medical device, biotech, but increasingly also health IT organizations, which is a newer player that, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have imagined playing part in clinical trials. The next area is the governmental agencies that work with city. The middle space is for patient advocacy organizations. Then we have the academic centers. And the last group here is a combination of IRBs, professional organizations, trade organizations, and things like that. But let's go into the vision for clinical trials as it was created by our executive committee. And this is sort of what we're calling Clinical Trials Vision 2030. So this vision was created as part of a strategic plan review. And what we did is really think about what clinical trials should look like optimally in 2030. Interestingly, as I mentioned, this was part of our strategic plan review that started in 2019, so before COVID happened. And we were hoping that with COVID, some of these things have moved further along a little bit than where we thought they would be. That might be the only good thing about COVID. But let's go through these different things. So the first one is that clinical trials are patient-centered and easily accessible. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. The next one is that clinical trials are fully integrated into health processes and really making clinical trials easier to conduct so we can create more knowledge for everyone involved, including patients, providers, and the community at large. Clinical trials should also be designed with a quality approach. Clinical trials should maximally leverage available data, which includes clinical and non-clinical data, such as data collected from digital technologies, so that we can minimize the collection of necessary trial-specific data. And then lastly, that clinical trials should contribute to the knowledge about how to prevent, diagnose, and treat disease. And clinical trials are one of the many sources of information that can be acted upon to improve population health. A little bit more about our vision for patient-centered and accessible trials. So what we mean is that patients should be fully integrated in the design and governance of clinical trials. And when possible, participation should be allowed without participants having to go to designated sites, clinical sites, to enroll or to participate. So the participation should be accessible from where the participant prefers it, such that home trials, hybrid trials, and the use of technology is really used to allow all potential participants to take part, not just the ones that happen to live close to a clinical trial center. Every potential participant should also be aware of any clinical trial that would be relevant to them, and the enrollment in clinical trial participants should reflect the diversity of the population expected to use the medical product. And we did a webinar about that. I'll talk about that in a second, but related to COVID treatment specifically, and Richard Knight helped us in that webinar, and that might be something you may take a look at, that really always we should reflect the diversity of the population, but specifically in COVID, there's really a requirement to take that seriously and make sure that the population included in the clinical trials or in the vaccine trials reflect the populations that are most heavily impacted. So we have created a lot of resources to support this vision. They're currently listed in areas of focus for us. So our quality areas, we've done a lot of work on quality by design, recruitment, and pregnancy testing, and recommendations are available for that. In our patient engagement area, we have patient groups, engagement, and we have different tools and resources there. We did some work around how to improve investigators and sites and strengthen the community and qualification just as much as reducing GCP inefficiencies. Digital health trials could have been part of the novel clinical trial designs, but they were important at the time that we started this work. So we have a couple of projects in that area that, again, also deal with decentralized clinical trials, getting us closer to that accessible clinical trial area. And then in novel clinical trial designs, we have sort of other novel things that you could do, is using real world data to plan eligibility criteria and enhance recruitment, embedding clinical trials into registries, and we also have done some work around antibacterial and HABVAP studies. And lastly, we've also done a lot of work around single IRB, organizing DMCs, data monitoring committees, improving the informed consent process, and developing a better IND safety reporting system. So now I'd like to pivot a little bit about how this vision intersects with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've done a lot of work related to the COVID pandemic. Our work can probably be divided up in two areas. Sort of the area of the trials that were ongoing when COVID hit, sort of the ongoing trials that, when people were required to have to stay at home, couldn't come to the clinics as much, like how do you keep your clinical trials going, and how to move to virtual visits for those ongoing trials. And those were related to the FDA guidance that had come out. But we've also done work around improving the design of high quality COVID treatment trials. And like I mentioned, engaging minority patient in COVID trials. We've also created a playbook on best practices for conducting regular trials that are non-COVID during the COVID pandemic, and also created a daily download of COVID clinical trials so you can kind of look at what kinds of research are being done. We've also engaged in a big effort around master protocols as a way to facilitate finding treatments for COVID, instead of doing a one-off trial with one drug, testing multiple drugs at the same time. That's ongoing. We're looking into co-enrollment. Normally, people would typically tell you that one participant should only be allowed to be in one clinical trial, but in times of COVID, especially thinking through some scenarios where drugs are repurposed and adverse events are pretty known from previous experience with the drugs, there might be an opportunity to maybe allow participants to be in more than one trial. We would then also would like to do some work around the lessons learned and how we can keep those going, especially as they relate to our Vision 2030. And then after the pandemic, we want to maintain the good parts of the transformation, want to help people think about contingency planning. I live in Florida, for example. We've always had plans for hurricanes, but COVID was slightly different in that not one side would be involved in a hurricane, and so you can plan for one side being offline for a while. Here, a lot of sites at the same time were offline. Different geographies were offline at different times, and sort of how can we plan for that better? We'd like to do an analysis of how clinical trials have changed and the ecosystem has changed, and then potentially do some other work as well. So specifically to clinical trials for COVID was really aligned with our vision that they have to be high quality and that the capacity has to increase for COVID-related trials. We should use clinical networks more often and also use master protocols more often, because you really can go from one site to multiple sites when you do that, and from testing one treatment to multiple treatments. And the clinical trial infrastructure really has to be reusable and able to cycle through options quickly, the options being the treatments. We really need to figure out a system that gets rid of things that don't work quickly, like the Recovery Project trial has done in the UK that showed that hydroxychloroquine did not work, and focus on things that show potential. They've also been able to show that dexamethasone would be helpful and things like that. We have to be flexible, creative, and nimble, keeping in mind that those who have to conduct the trials are busy at the moment. I mean, the hospitals are still hustling with COVID patients, and the participants might be scared, they might be alone, and we need to have trials that take all that into consideration. And we need to think about implications of pausing, stopping, and what might be happening more now is not starting non-COVID trials. So here's a picture of how visits have transitioned to remote. We did some surveys, and this showed us that people were really using everything that was available to them, because different trials may need different approaches, but within one trial, different participants may need different approaches. My parents, for example, would not know how to use Zoom, so for them, a phone call visit could work, whereas I could potentially do a Zoom call or a Skype call. So we just need to be flexible and use what's available to us. And all those things, show us that we've probably gotten closer to the Vision 2030, but that a lot of work still has to be done. And we really have to be able to figure out a way to keep the COVID changes that have happened to clinical trials, but also continue to do work and projects at City to get closer to this vision. And with that, I would like to thank you. I put in my contact information here and my Twitter handle. City also has Twitter handles that you can follow, and LinkedIn pages in which we're pretty active, letting you know about the new things that are happening. And if you go to our website, you will also see that there's an option to sign up for a newsletter where you would be kept abreast of all the changes that are coming up and all the new things we're doing. And so with that, I would like to thank you.
Doctor, thank you for joining us today and providing your insights on the topic. Very helpful to us. Now, we do have a question for you. AAKP has been a proud partner of CTTI over the course of the past 5 years. We believe your work is critically important to advancing innovations. Can you tell our patients of the potential future opportunities to become more involved in the work of CTTI?
Thank you for that question. One of the things I would say is there are many ways that patients can participate in cities projects. One of the things we've been thinking about doing, and you have my email, is for people to give their names so that when we start new projects, we will keep a list of those names and our project managers will be able to pull on that list to bring new people in to our work, which is always nice to sort of have some new faces and new ideas. Additionally, over the past couple of years, you have been working with City, and Richard Knight has come to our meetings and presented at our meetings. But also we have David White, who's been on our Patient Engagement Collaborative, the group that we co-founded with FDA to sort of have a discussion forum to talk about all things patient engagement. And there's gonna be, in the next couple of 6 months, we will be looking at adding some new people to that group. So you might wanna be on the lookout for announcement around that. But otherwise, people can provide their names, their experience to us, and we'd be more than happy to call upon them. And of course, the range includes participating at the individual level or AAKP becoming a member, and there's many possibilities within that. So we're most happy to talk about what make most sense for you.
Again, thank you, Dr. Tenaerts, and that concludes our research session number 2.